All right, so we got some interesting polling data here that is basically giving us a little bit of a glimpse into the minds of some of these Trump supporters, specifically the white and religious Trump supporters, which probably comprises a large majority of them, as Yahoo News via Business Insider is reporting here that 84%, the overwhelming majority of Trump voters, worry about discrimination against whites and think that Christianity is under attack. So listen, as somebody who happens to be white, I don't know if you could tell, but as somebody who happens to be white and also happen to go to a religious school from kindergarten all the way through high school, although I am an atheist right now, but that's sort of besides the point. As somebody who is white and as somebody who did go to a religious school for a vast majority of my life, I can say at face value, this is completely ridiculous, okay? But the underlying themes that are within this are really what I want to get to, because I think even though, there is no systemic or widespread discrimination against white people in this country, it is something that has been a talking point that has been weaponized by conservatives and even by fascists historically in the United States to basically get poor white working class Americans to blame the wrong people for problems that actually exist. And so I want to target that because I think this is more exemplifying basically not that these people are delusional, but that we as leftists and we as socialists need to be hammering home the message that no, it's not immigrants to blame for your economic hardships. It's actually the capitalist ruling class that is to blame for some of these problems. But let's get into some of the details here and see if it's revealing at all. So new polling released today by Project Homefire in partnership with University of Virginia's Center for Politics has found that Trump voters are animated by concerns about anti-white discrimination and the fate of Christianity in America. Okay, so again, as somebody who's white and as somebody who spent the majority of my life being religious, and also as somebody who happens to know even a tiny bit about U.S. history, okay, this is ridiculous and should be ridiculous to everybody who watches my videos at face value, okay? Obviously, in this country, hundreds of years of slavery, followed by over 100 years, over a century of extremely blatantly discriminatory policies against minorities in this country, all to protect the white supremacist institutions that this country was founded on. And then, even to this day, we have GOP and Republican lawmakers all across the country who are passing brazenly racist, discriminatory voting policies against minorities in this country, even to this day. So these are not problems that have gone away for minority communities here in the United States. But again, these are not problems that are affecting primarily white communities. But they continue saying that American racial and ethnic politics have reached their breaking point, begins the report contrasting Biden voters' views with those of Trump voters. And on the one side, Joe Biden voters see systemic racism in America as a serious problem based, but Donald Trump voters are on the other side of Biden voters on each of these issues, and by large margins, they worry that discrimination against whites will increase significantly in the next few years. So not only do they say that there's some discrimination against whites that exists in the country now, but they are fearing that something big is coming. And this is not surprising if you ever watch, like, for example, the most prominent or the most popular white supremacist propagandist in the country, Tucker Carlson. He frequently talks about things like the Great Replacement Theory, which is a very obvious and if you look at history, has been used many times throughout history, a racist white supremacist talking point, which basically is to try to convince people that expanding a multiracial democracy by allowing immigration into the country is somehow stealing power away from white people here. It's not stealing power away from white people unless you actually believe that the United States is built on white supremacist institutions, which Tucker Carlson would never admit, nor would any propagandist like himself ever admit. So there's this massive contradiction in the types of rhetoric that they are trying to use and types of conspiracy theories that they are trying to use. Well, even with these contradictions, lots of people believe this, right? It's intuitive for some people to think, oh, these foreigners, these scary outsiders are coming into the country and they're soaking up all the benefits and they're hurting my chance at getting a job, when that's exactly what the ruling class has always wanted people in the United States to believe. They want to pit working class Americans across racial lines. They want them to be pitted against each other so that they do not basically form a collective and go after the actual ruling class that is causing their problems. But just to get into a little bit more of the details here. So the polling found that 52% of Trump voters said they strongly agreed with the statement, quote, "I worry that discrimination against whites will increase significantly in the next few years," a figure that rises to 84% when including those that somewhat agree, and an even higher percentage, 61%, strongly agreed with the notion that Christianity is under attack in America today, which also rises to 84% when including people who somewhat agree. So on the Christianity front, I also think that this is completely ridiculous. I mean, if you wanted to say there was discrimination against any religion in this country over the last couple of decades, it has definitely been Islamophobia that has driven some of the policies in this country. Even just under the Bush administration, the dramatic expansion of surveillance and abuse, really, of Muslims in the United States. This is not a secret. But Christianity really is not one of those religions that has been prosecuted in any way, especially not by the U.S. government. So it's just not in line with reality. But they continue saying that, meanwhile, count, Biden voters largely disagreed. On both counts, only 38% of Biden voters strongly or somewhat agreed that anti-white discrimination is a problem and that Christianity is under attack, and 91% of Democrats strongly or somewhat agreed that systemic racism is America is a real and serious problem. So you see the absolutely massive divide there across party lines. And they continue saying that further polling conducted by the group revealed just how tied to immigration Trump voters' concerns were. Upwards of 80% of them strongly or somewhat agreed that they were worried about paying higher taxes due to illegal immigrants using healthcare, welfare, and education resources. A similar percentage were strongly or somewhat in agreement with the notion that they would suffer personally from the U.S. being more socialist as a result of immigration. So listen, you got to be honest when analyzing these types of things. And this is why I say this type of polling data can be useful to socialist propagandists like myself, right? I see this polling data and I say these are a lot of people who could be open potentially to socialist policies, who could be open to favoring policies if they actually were adequately or accurately educated as to what they would actually result in, right? This is why I push for Medicare for all. And that means Medicare for all, not just Medicare for the people who happen to be on my side of the political spectrum, right? Medicare for all would mean Medicare for even some shitty people, right? Medicare for even racist Trump supporters in many cases. But the point is, when you create universal programs, when you allow a working class solidarity that goes across party lines, that goes across racial lines and ethnic lines and political divides and stuff like that, and across culture war issues as well, what you do is you actually weaponize collective bargaining among the American people, essentially in the same way that you would do in a union, which many of these Trump supporters would be in unions, so they would understand this concept of collective bargaining. But when you are able to have a universal program, you are weaponizing collective bargaining by the American people against some of the corporate interests, some of the capitalist interests that are actually exploiting and making a lot of these people's lives more difficult. So as a socialist propagandist myself, I look at polling data like this and I say, you know, what could we do to bring these people over to our side? Because they think that they would suffer personally from the U.S. being more socialist, when if you are a working class Trump supporter, Trump is the one who is more likely to increase suffering for you personally by doing things like passing the 2017 tax cuts for the wealthy, which was the biggest accomplishment of his entire career. So he blows up the military budget, he blows up tax cuts for the rich, and meanwhile he does absolutely nothing to expand the social safety net, to invest in average Americans, to support working class Americans. And that's not to say that Democrats are doing that perfectly by any stretch of the imagination, but the point is, as socialists, as leftists, it is our job to reach out to people like this and make sure that they understand that these socialist policies, whether it's, you know, nationalizing big pharma that would lower prescription drug prices and stop them from being completely screwed over. I mean, do you think that rural Trump supporters don't need lower prescription drugs? Of course they do. Do you think that they don't need better education standards, that they don't need access to free at the point of service healthcare? Of course they need all of these things, which are the things that socialists are pushing for, right? And so this is how we end up losing if we don't address this problem of what they are thinking, whether it's wrong or not, which it obviously is. But if we don't address this gap in what a lot of these Trump supporters and a lot of what conservative Republicans and rural Republicans in general think about socialist policies, then we're losing out a large portion of this, this voting bloc essentially, that could be then weaponized by fascists, by fake populists like Donald Trump, who are going to then blame these problems on immigrants while trying to protect the interests of the ruling class. And that's exactly what Donald Trump did. So listen, again, I think the bigger story in terms of polling like this is not that necessarily all Trump supporters are crazy and delusional, even though the view that they outlined here at the top, that, you know, white people and Christians are being persecuted against, is obviously delusional. But the main point here is not necessarily that they are all delusional and unreasonable and unreachable. The actual main point here is that we on the left need to be reaching out and telling these people about what the actual socialist policies that we support could do to materially improve their lives, and get them to understand that no, your enemy is not the immigrant that's coming over and is just trying to work and supply food and shelter and all of these basic necessities for themselves and their families. Your enemy is actually the capitalist oligarchy. Your enemy is the ruling class that is exploiting you on a day-to-day basis.